So now I have the distinct pleasure of introducing John Powell. Do you know who he is? So I'm going to skip all the things that you can read about him, his titles, his accomplishments, all of those kinds of things. If you don't know them, they're so easily available to you. What I do want to talk to you about, aside from the fact that if you haven't read his book, Racing to Justice, have you read that book? Yeah. If you haven't read that book, you need to read that book. That's all I can say. There's so much amazing information in there. It completely changed how I thought about so many things. But I want to talk to you about is his spirituality, his practices, his concept of self, his empathy that stems from his spiritual practice. So clearly John has a brilliant mind, yes? Yes. But he also has a shimmering heart. Yes. And he is truly, truly an integrated visionary with a talent for connecting disparate ideas that both question and embrace what does it mean to be fully human. He has been quoted as saying, listen to this, if we really get quiet, we're able to see different expressions of ourselves come forward. And this reminds me of that expression, Ubuntu. You are my other me. Without you, I don't really exist. And it's known that meditative practices can bring insight, but John has this amazing passion that is also quiet and potent. He embraces paradox in everything that he does. So please help me welcome, with all the love in your heart and all the respect that you have, for Dr. John Powell.
First of all, I want to thank all of you, and again, all of those who support this effort here and going forward and going backwards. This is actually an amazing journey, and I'm delighted to be on it with you. But I want to take a minute and just acknowledge that in Nepal yesterday, there was an earthquake, and at this point, I think over 1,000 people have been counted dead. So if we could just take a moment to acknowledge the loss of our sisters and brothers in Nepal. Thank you. That was a beautiful introduction by Shakti, and what many of you don't know is that a lot of people here, Carolyn Brandy, I knew her a long time ago. Let's just leave it at that. At the Yellow House in Seattle, before my 37-year-old daughter was born. And Shakti, and I don't know if Shakti's husband is here, Rick Butler, but Rick and I went to school together. And I couldn't believe years later that he had grown up to be a filmmaker, working with Shakti, who's a fabulous filmmaker. And many of you, Paul Moore and Gerald Lenoir, people I've known over 40 years. So it's wonderful to see all of the old friends and new friends come together as we really try to make an impact on what's going on and create a belonging world that's real. And so that's what this is about. This whole conference is about othering and belonging. And in some ways, I would say that's the problem of the 21st century. It's not just a problem here in California, in the United States. It's a problem all over the world. When we watch people being turned back from Europe, when we watch people being denied, when we watch trafficking and slavery, we watch every expression where we actually deny the belonging of others. And I would just extend that and say it's not just belonging of humans, it's belonging of all life and life expression. So we have to actually broaden that. It's not just a circle of human concern, it's a circle of all life. And if you want to get deeper into that, you will in a little bit when you hear from Joanna Macy, because she helped me learn that years ago. We're going through some interesting times right now. And there's a book by Samuel Huntington called Who Are We? And I want to strongly encourage that you don't buy the book. If you want to buy a book, buy Jeff Chan's book, Who We Be. Now, those two books are at extremes in some ways. Some of you may know Jeff. I don't know if he's here today, but Jeff writes about the colorization of America, what's happening of America, and the anxiety as we become more diverse. But so does Samuel Huntington. But Samuel Huntington writes about it as like, ah! Too many brown people, too many brown people. But he represents something in America. He represents a hardcore conservative reaction to a growing diversity. He writes about the anxiety that's actually going across our country right now. And he does see it as a threat. He talks about basically losing America. The people who say, taking back America. And they're not talking about taking it back from corporations. They're talking about taking it back from people who don't look like them, people who they think of as others. Whereas Jeff talks about the changing of America and actually building something where there is no other. So in a way, we're dealing with three strong separations. And these separations are all, in some ways, of the same cloth, but it's also useful to talk about them separately. One is the separation from ourselves. Another is the separation from the other, or the person we call the other. And the third is the separation from the earth. And these separations go back to the Enlightenment. This has actually been what Western society has been about. It's been about building and celebrating separations. The reality is that we're not separate. We are deeply connected to each other. But how do we actually learn to celebrate that, to exercise that muscle, to recognize it? We are connected, but how do we actually live that connection? And what we do is we figure all these ways to pretend we're not connected. Our sexual orientation, our race, our gender, our age, our language, our disability. We use all these things to try to pretend that we're not connected. And when we pretend we're not connected, we're in the process of othering. We're in the process of denying not only someone's humanity, but denying our own humanity and denying our connectedness. And the thing that scares Samuel Huntington is that we're connected. The reason the right wing is against Social Security is not because of what it costs, it's because it's social. It connects us. So anything that talks about our connectivity is a disturbance. Now, this doesn't just happen on a conscious level, this happens on an unconscious level. And the interesting stuff about the unconscious is also social. And you'll hear from Rodolfo a little later today about the unconscious. So we have these large structures where we're actually seeing that we're deeply connected. And we also have mind science that's talking about how the mind works, not the conscious mind, which is quite small. If we talked about processing information, we process about 40 bits of information a second consciously. And in that same second, we process 11 million bits of information unconsciously. So the unconscious is doing all the work. And part of this journey is to relax into the unconscious, to learn to talk to the unconscious, to free up those parts of ourselves that we're not in touch with. The unconscious does a lot of work. It sorts, it creates associations, and it fills in gaps. The unconscious is very, very fast. The conscious is very slow. So oftentimes we think the way that we actually connect is to not see that we have differences. And we're afraid of differences at the conscious level. And so we say we all have to be the same. And we are all the same in terms of our human value, but we're not all the same in terms of our human expression. And so while the conscious is running away from our different expressions, the unconscious is noticing, categorizing, and oftentimes reflecting the response that society has said about those differences. So when we see someone We may not want to notice their race. In our society today, we've learned that race is a bad thing, and so we don't want to see it. But the unconscious, while we're trying not to see it, is having a meeting, writing memos. And so we have to learn to actually engage at that level. We also know that sometimes when we are the other people to the extreme, we actually don't even see them as human. This is work from Susan Fiss, and she shows that there's a part of the brain that lights up when we see another human being. It's a nice evolutionary trick. Fellow species light up. But there's some people, when we see them, people who are in the far left-hand corner, bottom left-hand corner, that when we see them, that part of the brain doesn't light up. And in fact, instead of that part of the brain lighting up, another part of the brain lights up, a part of disgust and fear. So when we see homeless people, this is national surveys, national testing of how we react to different people at an unconscious level. And the Dalai Lama, in a book that he's written, he talks about engaging experiment with someone where they see someone homeless, the part of the brain doesn't light up. And then they say, what kind of vegetables do you think that person likes? And the part of the brain lights up. All of a sudden, the person is human again. So we have to be very conscious of how we actually engage in processes, individually and collectively, to other. It's not just a mental process, it's also a structural process. So think about things like apartheid. What is apartheid but other than saying apartheid means separation? You're not part of this community. You're not a part of who we are. Think about how we used to lock up people who were disabled and put them off someplace because it made us uncomfortable. Think about the continued segregation in housing and schools all across the country and right here in the Bay Area. All these are structural expressions of saying, you don't belong. Think about young Black and Latinos being shot every day in the United States by police. And one part of the response is, Black lives matter. What they're saying is, we belong. We belong. And the killing is an extreme expression of saying, no, you don't. Your life doesn't matter. We all live in structures, but we're not situated the same as structures. So part of it is, how do we make structures do the work of belonging, as well as the mind science? These are important issues. And it's not just interaction between people. So we see today that government, which has a major role in creating a space where we all belong, has in many ways abandoned that space. The government has been repurposed to serve the elites, to serve corporation. Some people call that neoliberalism. But I say if neoliberalism is the vehicle, then the anxiety about the other is the fuel. It is what actually supports the role the government should be repurposed for the elites. And if you think about when did this happen, how did this happen? It started Nixon, Reagan, Goldwater. Nixon said, law and order. You know, sometime I turn on television, I go through. When I was growing up, there was one program on television about law and order. It was called Dragnet. Now, every channel, any time of day, there's some program about law and order. Law and order is about fear. And when Nixon talked about law and order, what he was saying is that those people marching in the streets who want to belong, called the Civil Rights Movement, they are out of order. They're out of place. Their place is not in my community. Their place is not in my school. Their place is not in my life. Their place is not at the voting booth. They don't belong. And that resonated with the fans of Samuel Huntington. That resonated with them. They weren't talking about people robbing, killing, or stealing from each other. They were talking about people claiming their right to belong. And Reagan wasn't going to be outdone by Nixon. So Nixon talked about law and order. Reagan talked about a war on drugs. And when he said that, I wrote something at the time saying, really what he's saying is a war on the black community. And when people talk about, how do we have tanks in Ferguson? I said, go back to Nixon. And when you're in a war with people, they're not people. You're claiming, you're declaring that they don't belong, that their lives don't matter. We're not just dealing with issues interpersonally, we're dealing with an economy that's extremely rigged toward the elites. We're talking about an economy that's corporate, a financial economy. But when we think about this economy, we think about who we are. We can think of ourselves as economic beings. And I say, we're human beings, not human havings. So our identity is not just around what we have, but it's also around who we are. So we have different ways of sort of organizing our being around the economy, around power and agency and politics, and around who we are. And that last one, in some ways, is the least developed. And it's least developed, especially for people who think of themselves as left of center or progressives, in part because we're nervous about leaning into questions about being, which quickly takes us into spirituality and religion. And we walked away from that and conceded that to the right. We can't concede that to the right. When you look at the economic inequality in the country, and I know you probably can't make sense of this chart, but the gist of it is that before we had economic polarization, we had political polarization. And the political polarization started in the 1970s. It started in response to the civil rights movement and the anxiety that conservative whites were feeling about blacks and then Latinos and other groups claiming to belong. And the political polarization then created the economic polarization. And the attack in terms of economic polarization wasn't just on people, it was on the government itself, the role of government to help people. And so we had a repurposing of government. And so now we think government can't do anything. As Reagan said, government's not the solution, it's the problem. And we oftentimes say, well, you know, government is too big, or we talk about deregulation. And it's not really deregulation, because there have been thousands and thousands of new regulations, but they're mainly to protect capital. And you're going to hear later tomorrow, if you hear from Naomi Klein, about stuff about what that means. When government can't protect people, when government can't protect the environment, when government can't protect each other, all it's doing is being a servant to the elites. So how do we practice our being in our everyday life? First of all, this is a quote that I like James Baldwin. And James Baldwin reminds us that we're all androgynous and that we're part of each other. And he ends the quote by saying, some of my countrymen find that inconvenient and even unfair. And at times, so do I. But none of us can do anything about it. We are part of each other. But how do we begin to live that? And we begin to live that by creating empathetic space. And empathetic space is a fancy word of saying loving space. As Cornel West says, justice is the public face of love. To recognize that we're all connected. What supports those connections? We've already seen it in this conference. Being present. And it's not easy to be present, because being present also means, as Andrew suggested last night, being present with pain, being present with difficulty, not just being present with nice stuff. being loving and caring, and being vulnerable. If we open up our hearts, we will experience more pain, but we'll also experience more joy. And as Joanna has taught us many times, to co-create together. Our process of being here in the world is not just to live in it, it's to co-create something better. This is the circle of human concern, or the circle of life concern. And we actually can see, as I showed you earlier, who's in the circle and who's not. Literally, some people are not seen as human in our society. And if you don't see people as human, if you despise them, you will not pass policies to actually benefit them. Even if those policies would save money, you want to punish them. There was an experiment done where they polled people and said, what do you think of letting people in prison get a high school or college degree? People said, no, not a good idea. Then they asked us, from the same pool, they asked people a second question. What if we make people in prison get a high school or college degree? I'm for that one. Not what it costs, it's like they're other. How do we punish them? So we can punish them by making them go to college? Yes. So we need to have a circle of human concern with no one outside the circle, no one. And we had a meeting yesterday, and at the end of the meeting, people were saying, what about the Koch brothers? And I know that's hard. And I'm not saying we have to embrace their policies. I'm not saying we have to embrace their politics, but we can't deny their humanity. No one's outside the circle of human concern. Whether you're black, whether you're white, whether you're disabled, whether you're gay, whether you're straight, whether you're a crook, no one's outside the circle of human concern. It doesn't mean we tolerate all activity, but we celebrate our shared humanity. The problem is, in our society, we put corporations in the center of human concern. And when we do that, all people outside the circle of human concern. We have societies that are not structured to actually serve people. And while corporations may make good servants, they make terrible masters. And right now, they are masters in our society. Sabawanu, it's a South African saying which means, I or we see you. I see you. I see you. And the response is, I am here. In order for me to see you, I have to be present. And when they say, I see you, it doesn't mean just you. It means those who come before you, your ancestors, and those who will come after you. And I am here. And we notice for people who are marginalized and othered, they're not seen, they're noticed. We notice them, but we don't see them. We don't see their humanity. So we have to work at all these different levels. And it's not an easy task. And even after we acknowledge that we're related, there's a question as to what are the right relationships? Because a master and a slave are related. But it's not the right relationship. An abusive husband and an abused wife are related, but it's not the right relationship. How do we actually begin to build, think, and tell stories about the right kind of relationships? How do we actually make sure that people are seen in our stories, that we're not closeting people? I'm going to end, but I'll tell you a quick story. I'm sitting at home years ago watching a television program with my daughter, and it's a horror movie. It's a bad horror movie. I don't know if they're good horror movies, but this one was especially bad. And there's a young white girl, blonde, and she was in the house with the monster. And the monster's in the closet. You know those movies with the monsters in the closet? So she gets ready to open the door, and my daughter goes, ah! And I said, don't worry, nothing's going to happen to her. And she said, have you seen this movie before? I said, in some ways, many times. And then the Latino pizza guy shows up. And I say, that's the monster's food. And of course, he gets eaten by the monster right away. And my daughter's saying, how did you know? And it's only recently, in the last few years, that blacks and Latinos get to live to the end of the movie. So it's also how we tell stories, it's how we do dance. It's important to learn to love. And one of the things that Joanna Macy taught me years ago in one of her powerful books, World as Lover, World as Self. Again, it's not only important to love ourselves and close up and personal, it's important to love the world because the world is ourself. So this conference is about reclaiming and living and practicing belonging, where no humans and no life are outside the circle of concern. Thank you. I'm going to invite Joanna and Rodolfo to come up to the stage. You're going to hear from them in a little bit. They're both really incredible people. Rodolfo is a colleague at Berkeley and in social psychology. Rodolfo Mendoza-Denton, and he's written a book on Is Everyone a Racist? He's done incredible research, and he focuses on what's going on in the unconscious. How does it actually trip us up? How does it move differently than the conscious? And he's going to share that with us this morning. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for being here. Professor Powell, thank you for your comments. You'll notice that Professor Powell, towards the end of his talk, had a triangle of transformative change. And on that side, to the right, or my right anyway, of that triangle, there was this term, implicit bias. And we hear that term a lot these days. How is it that implicit bias affects us? How is it that implicit bias affects our unconscious behavior? Things like police shootings, things like the way that we educate our students. What is it that we refer to by implicit bias? I don't want to assume that all of us know that term or what it means. So I thought I'd give just a little bit of a demonstration for the group. I'll need your participation, as you were so gracious in doing a little bit earlier. I need from you, and I have my own notes here, so I'm not checking my messages. I am looking at my notes. I need from you now, if I don't mind, think of things. I'm going to ask for 4 categories, and then I'm going to ask people to raise their hand. I'm going to ask for bugs. I'm going to ask for examples of flowers. I'm going to ask for things that are good in life and then things that are bad in life. So let's start with the things that are good in life. What are some examples of things that are good in life? Puppies. Thank you very much. Elizabeth, I see puppies and perfect. Let's just take that for the moment. They're actually in here that I'm in my own notes. Okay, now let's think of a few, and I know that different people have different, conceptions of what falls into good versus bad. But let's stick to the universals. What are some things that are bad? Genocide, war, earthquakes, death, taxes, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. Now let's think about, I see Billy Curtis in the audience. Billy, how about a bug? Cockroaches. Okay, other creepy crawlies. Mosquitoes. Let's stick to mosquitoes, and let's stick to bugs. Let's stick to cockroaches, flies, etc. Fireflies and ladybugs can fall a little bit in the middle, and that's just not for today. Okay. How about now flowers? Flowers. Carnation. Naila. Huh? Roses, carnations, chrysanthemums, lilies, etc., etc. Okay. So now I can't do this with my phone in my hand, but I'll have to do. Okay. Now, please raise your right hand. Shake the hand of the person next to you. All right. And now raise your left hand. Now raise your left hand. This is my left. Okay. Okay. Now this is your right and this is your left. So now, okay, put the hands on the table, please. Okay? And we're going to work with these 4 categories, and we're going to divide these categories into 2. For this moment, your right hand is going to represent those good things that we talked about, the puppies and the babies, right? As well as the flowers, the roses, the chrysanthemums, the carnations. On your left hand, we're going to have the bugs, the spiders, the cockroaches. I'm not going to mention ladybugs. I have a ladybug t-shirt, actually. The spiders, the cockroaches, as well as the war, the famine, the taxes, the death. Okay? So right hand, good and flowers. Left hand, bugs and bad. Okay? You'll hear me say a word, and you please, if you could tap the appropriate hand or wherever you are best able to do so. Okay. Are we ready? Sunshine, war, marigold, cockroach, beetle, worm, happy, peace. Okay, we understood the rhythm and the cadence of that. Prank, 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 prank. That is a measure that we can index of the association between the particular terms. In this particular case, between flower terms and things that are good. Now let's do another exercise. I'm simply going to switch 2 of the categories. Let's have flowers and bad terms over here on your right. So flowers and bad on the right, and bugs and good on the left. Okay? Same list. Rose, death, belonging, puppies, marigold, carnation. You can hear it. You can feel it. And I got to tell you, it's not a practice effect. If I did the reverse, you would see much greater facility to the terms that are consistent, to the terms that are inconsistent. And of course, that's with flowers and bugs. But what happens when the names that are associated with the categories are now things like Rodolfo, are now things like Juana, like Maria, like Yusuf, as opposed to things like Brittany, as opposed to things like Ludwig, as opposed to things like Heather, for example. That's the implicit attitude test, and you can find it online, and there's a number of categories, usually associating social categories with things that are good, things that are bad. It's a measure of your association between a social category on the one hand, and then the strength of that category and its link to what is good, what is bad, babies and puppies, pestilence and war, et cetera, et cetera. We can measure this, and we love to do this as psychologists, really get an accurate measure of your level of implicit bias and your level of unconscious prejudice. We take these association tests and we feel, oh my gosh, I have been branded. We ask people to go through psychology experiments where we ask them to take this test, and it turns out that this implicit level of prejudice is associated with a deep region in your brain called the amygdala. And the amygdala, the more you have these implicit associations of prejudice, the more your amygdala lights up. What is the amygdala? The amygdala is 2 almond-shaped structures deep in your reptilian brain that index threat, that index negativity. But it's a narrative. It's a narrative about the understanding of our science, and that narrative is actually changing. It's a narrative that actually makes us very nervous, because all of a sudden, that science makes you jump into the narrative of, well, do I have this prejudice? Is my amygdala lighting up? I can't do anything about this reptilian brain of mine because it's so deep within myself. There's this notion of immutability around implicit bias. There's this notion that somehow we have captured in this test something more true about you than, for example, your egalitarian tendencies. Briefly, in my dissertation, I had pictures of white and black social targets. And people were evaluating how aggressive these targets were simply on the basis of the pictures. The pictures didn't differ other than on the racial cues. When people were paying full attention, they made no distinction in the rated aggression of these targets. But when I asked people to think about something else, to monitor another process, they became busy, under cognitive load, as we say, and then you showed this deep racial bias. And that's nice, except that people say, aha, when you're under cognitive load, that really reveals who you really are deep down inside. And that is a phrase that I want to repeat, who you really are deep down inside. It's kind of like going all the way down to the amygdala, who you really are deep down inside. Please raise your right hand again, if you don't mind, or consider your right hand. Take your thumb, put it inside, towards the palm, and wrap your hand around, and then go like this. And that's a picture of your brain. Okay? Okay. Prefrontal cortex, inside is the limbic system. This is what people refer to here, and this is the brainstem. This limbic system is what people think about as the reptilian brain, as you thought about these very much, very deeply ingrained evolutionary inherited structures that signal threat. It's almost like we see ourselves as, reptiles going, threat over there, so snake over there, and that is what lights up. So when our amygdala lights up, and it is really true, people come into the lab and people judge black faces versus white faces, Muslim faces versus American faces. People's amygdalas light up differently. So there's a narrative in our science about how the amygdala signals threat and danger, and that amygdala then signals something very deep about our differences. And yet the amygdala, we now know, serves a different function. The amygdala actually turns out to be a signal of what we need to pay attention to. So depending on the small changes that are actually part of the upper crust of the brain, the more recent crust, the amygdala lights up differently. So it turns out that while the brain does respond differently to people of different backgrounds, you can do small changes that actually change brain activation down at the level of the limbic system, of the amygdala. For example, if you bring people into the lab and you say, these folks are Oakland Warriors fans, and these folks are Pelicans fans, and please look at them. And now rate them in terms of likability, or just simply look at them, turns out that your amygdala will now differentiate between the Pelicans fans and the Warriors fans. In other words, there is no basis to the idea that somehow race, that somehow skin color is privileged in our reptilian brain. Rather, there's this funny way in which our top-down categories influence judgments from the bottom up. Things at the level of 100 milliseconds, things that we used to think were so automatic that they couldn't be anything but evolutionarily derived, are actually under our cognitive control. What does that mean? It means that we have to take our top-down processes seriously, so that when Professor Powell says, let's address our implicit biases, we're not talking about immutable evolutionary characteristics that we have to work really hard to overcome, but we will never really achieve. We will achieve, and it takes a lot of work. We will explore in this conference, I think, the reasons why these social categories are so ingrained in us. And it's not, it's not untrue that these are not deeply ingrained, that they're not difficult patterns to break. They're reinforced, as we learned, by our individual behavior, by our communities, by our social structures. But biologically determined, they are not. Thank you.
So now you have a chance to hear from Joanna Macy. And again, her bio is in your packet, but let me just say a few things about Joanna. as I said earlier, she influenced me years ago. I try to read everything she writes, but it's hard because she writes so much. But it's also quite profound. And she's a eco-feminist Buddhist shaman master. She's also a Jedi. One of the things Joanna does, I think as well as anyone in the world, is sort of bring these things together. So one of her books, she talks about the relationship between systems theory, spirituality, and Buddhism. And it's really a profoundly important book. I don't know what she's going to talk about this morning, but I can hardly wait because everything she says is profound. And she doesn't just talk about it, she actually has practices, practical things people do to actually embody some of the work that she writes about. So with that, I give you Joanna Macy.
Wow. Am I ever glad I came here today to hear John Powell say your name. It's so wonderful. And Rudy, I have to thank you too. Now I realize a lot of what I've been doing is discovering that hidden thumb of the limbic brain and helping people to find its pliability, its pleasures, its adventures. At any rate, what I want to talk about today is the way we other ourselves. And this is the phenomenon of, well, I made some notes, but I'll hold them up like this. The way in our culture today, particularly now, in a situation where the plight of life on Earth is at a greater danger point that has been known certainly since the beginning of the human story, probably since the beginning of complex life forms. And there are a lot of us, in the most understandable reasons, who step back, other ourselves from belonging to such a messy situation and such a despairing situation. So that I'm talking about ways of othering where you just get too cool to care, where you get too scared to care, where you get too busy to care, where you get too distracted to care. Oh, this is wonderful. Thank you. Wonders never cease. So that there's a phenomenon today that has preoccupied me very much for the last, and since I started learning and working with general systems theory, living systems theory, is the way we marginalize ourselves and withdraw ourselves and don't want to belong to a situation that is getting more severe all the time. And particularly, so you meet those, particularly in this country, where in America, with its sense of manifest destiny and grounded on almost a messianic hope that we're going to save the world, and the competent person is optimistic. The competent person smiles a lot. The competent person and successful person, and that's the way we sell politicians and toothpaste, is we are in command and everything's quite all right and I'm in charge and nothing can distress or surprise me. And so at a time, this really, I realized that how the extent to which this refusal to see and to know is blocking the feedback that any species, and certainly any democracy, any society needs in order to keep on going. We have to be able to see the results of our behavior. That's feedback, and we are guided by that. Now, we become immune to that pretty quickly. One is by government censorship. I remember when my spirits fell back, this was at the same time when I learned that the government had commissioned studies on the effects of oil spills. I was aware of how they'd been funding studies of contamination, nuclear contamination around reactors, and then defunded them and buried them. But we helped the government also by saying, oh, well, this is beyond me, and we even take refuge in our own powerlessness. So that becomes a positive feedback loop. And I bring up, I discovered this after I'd been involved in a citizen's lawsuit against a nuclear power plant that was racking its fuel rods too close together. And I had been doing for the citizen's lawsuit a lot of research on the health effects that were happening around every nuclear installation, even without an accident. Oh my God, if people just know this, it's curtains for the nuclear industry, and I'll tell them. Could I tell them? No. Eyes would glaze over. Conversations would change. The feeling of knocking on doors or screaming from the rooftops, hey guys, listen. So I became very intrigued by how is it? And I saw how activists, myself included, and organizations were amping up the delivery of painful information. And don't you realize there's 60,000 nuclear warheads on the alert? And don't you know how many children are starving in Africa? And don't you know? And it didn't seem to be working. And so the activists were decrying public apathy. Back then, one day, my daughter, who was in high school, came back home from school with a riddle. And I'll have a glass of water, John. And she, thank you. I didn't realize I'd already poured it. So she said, Mom, what's the difference between ignorance and indifference? And so I, being quite literal at the moment, said, well, of course, you know, ignorance, not knowing. And as I was going on, she just shrugged her shoulders and said, I don't know and I don't care. And I thought, is that so? People do care. I see it, and people do know. Who do they need to hear this from then? They need permission and capacity and occasion to hear this from the one voice that they need to hear it from, and that is their own. And so began what we've come to call the work that reconnects, where in groups is really, you can do it in books, as I do, but it's much better in groups where you can talk spontaneously, talk in a safe place, and you can tell the truth about what you see and feel and know is happening to your world. You know, I don't need to tell you about the 6 mass extinctions. I don't need to recite about the poisoned rivers and the radioactive oceans and the plastic. You know that. What we need to do is make it stretch ourselves so that we can honor and befriend the natural feelings that come up. And what comes up? Grief, sorrow, outrage, fear, dread, overwhelm, futility, despair. And what we found, we don't try to talk people out of that. You befriend it. You honor it. Because all that shows that you are capable of suffering with your world. That is a wonderful thing. That shows that you're not just an isolated, insistent little defense thing off to the side, but that you are part of this organic web of life, that you are capable of suffering with your world. That's the literal meaning of compassion. You are a compassionate person. And you're not going to get over it just by talking about it. But what happens is that then you begin to see how big you are and how far what's meaningful and beautiful and alive in you stretches beyond the social constructs of your isolated self, your social persona. That there are in you the roaring of the seas and the whole spinning of the stars and the whole story of the awakening of self-conscious awareness on this planet, in other beings and in the humans. And you wake up to a recognition of who you really are. You're like a neuron in the mind of a great being, and it can think through you and act through you, and you can trust that. And with that trust comes love, and comes the recognition that we want to belong. We belong here. It's been a long time. We've been part of that belonging since the first splitting and spinning of the stars. We've been part of that belonging for 14 billion years. And now we're reaching that point together. Each one of us who's alive now, brought to this place of choice where we can belong in a new way. And belonging means what? What evokes belonging for you? I think of belonging when I see geese flying through the sky in a beautiful formation, when I see a ballet, when I see great maneuvers of the dancers and when you're marching, when you're acting. So our belonging, because we are verbs, and so we experience belonging how? By doing together. Not just by sitting and looking how nice you are, but linking arms and getting out there and doing things that you admire each other for, taking risks for the sake of life on earth. Yes. So we don't abandon. The fear. We don't cathart it and get rid of it. One thing, it comes up all the time. But also because keeping it helps us identify with all the others. There are a lot of lonely people out there. So keep a finger on your loneliness. Life isn't all just about merging. It's about the nobility of standing with misunderstanding and separation, and you know how that feels, and so that helps you reach and identify with people. I suppose I haven't gotten to doing that with the Koch brothers yet, but I'm about, I think. You know, I had more to say, but I feel, you already get it. And it's just, I want you to feel how exquisite it is, and you know it, to be alive at this point, where everything we've ever learned about courage, about suffering and exclusion, about loneliness and about interconnectedness, all of that is useful now. And we can live, as what helps me is to live with a sense of two levels of consciousness. One, there's just bumping along, the ups and downs of Joanna stubbing her toe and failing her through ordinary life. Being glad when somebody like John Powell says my name. Ooh, this is this ordinary human being. the separate Joanna. But then there's a Gaia Joanna. Just as there's a Gaia for each of you, there's the wholeness there. You're experiencing the wholeness. And they're both there. They're both precious. In the Hindu religion, they were imaged as two birds on a tree. I might find it easier to think of them because I can move back and forth. So we celebrate our stupidities and our failures too. And think how beautiful it is that you don't have to be perfect in order to belong, in order to be one with the big belonging, which is our story in this universe. Thank you.
So Rudy and Joanna, I'm going to ask each one of you a question, and then I'm going to give each of you a chance to ask the question. And unfortunately, we're then going to have to end. So we won't have a chance to take questions from the people in the room or the overflow room, but you will have a chance to continue this discussion in smaller groups later. So really, one of the things that's hard is both you and Joanna talked about fear, and you implied the automaticness of the unconscious, and you were talking about ways in which to live with that and make it work for us. But there are a lot of people who are strategically using that fear to continue to separate us. There are a lot of people who don't want to be in this great belonging. And this is both social and individual. How do we move to actually embrace that and not harden from those people?
That's a great question, John. I do have, if I may, just one quick clarification for the audience. The model of the brain that I showed, I do need to say this. This is actually something that Dr. Dan Siegel, who's written a wonderful book recently, wrote. So it's not my representation. I do need to put that out there for everybody.
He's part of you anyway, so.
And thank you for saying that, because you just captured exactly my answer. He is part of me, I am part of him. What you have spoken about, being part of each other, is pretty much, as I see it, the only way to try to overcome some of our strongest walls that we make around ourselves, some of that fortresses. Simply making a friend from another group, reaching out to other people. At our most basic, we are social creatures. And the empathy, the compassion that we develop towards others is the fundamental engine through which we can begin to move from that othering term to the arrow towards that belonging term. And I spoke briefly about how that magic happens, like, for example, when you're watching your favorite sports team together. I know that I experienced it in a deep and moving way post 9/11 in New York City, where suddenly I had a lot of neighbors that I had never spoken to before. Experiences can and do bring us together, but they are intimately social. And the deeper those friendship and those human bonds become, the more opportunity there is to humanize another human being. That's one of the themes that you spoke about in your talk. Once you do that, then the group becomes a little less mysterious, a little less other, a little less different, and you can begin to incorporate that. And it's hard work because those fortresses are often built upon years and years of fears and insecurities, but it can be done.
Thank you. So Joanna, you've written and talked a lot about issues around globalization and the whole Earth, right? So that as difficult as it is to have a deep relationship with someone in the same room, how do we have deep relationships with the people in Nepal, people in China, the people in Brazil? How do we have deep relationships with the Earth? And again, you sort of write about this both at a very intimate level, but also as a systems level. Can you help us to sort of, because it seems clear to me from your writing and from where we are, we can't just think of ourselves as this room of the United States. We're part of the whole Earth.
Well, you don't need face-to-face contact, do you, in order to recognize that, well, just like Dr. King, when he was in the last year of his life, he was talking about what we have for breakfast that comes from across the world, Martin Luther King, that we are held in an inescapable network of mutuality. And he pointed us to the orange juice and the coffee and the eggs, or what have you wanted to. That globalization is, as well as the news reports, is bringing us to a sense of sometimes quite intimate relatedness with people we'll never see. We can feel that can be rich. It can also be devastating as we look at what our tax dollars and our military might and our weapons industry are doing to people in the Middle East and around, and in Eastern North Africa and so forth. That it's not just there. So I think this is we're at a point in human history where that capacity in our heart minds, because this is where the Buddhists locate their mind, is in the heart, it's holistic, where we practice experiencing this. So this water, we're learning how precious this is. Life is water. And yet, our culture is trying to privatize it. And our corporations all over the world. But there are people, so I take this sip of water, and I think of the people in Cochabamba in Bolivia who risked arrest and worked so hard to toss out Bechtel and others' efforts to own the water. I think that we're all ingenious enough to be able to develop for our children, and certainly for ourselves, ways that we use this. And in the Sarvodaya movement that I've worked with in South Asia, this is a Buddhist-inspired movement whose name, Sarvodaya Shramadana, means everybody wakes up by working together. And that and you wake up in 3 ways simultaneously. Purushodaya, you wake up as a person and find what's most truly you, your true nature of kindness and caring. You wake up on your village level, Gramodaya, Deshodaya, national, and then Vishvodaya, you wake up as a world. So we're doing that. I don't think we do it consecutively, but just a lot of our ingenuity can go into that, can't it?
Yes, it can. So I've been informed that we're out of time. Oh, now I've been informed that we have more time. So, Rudy, would you like to ask the question of Joanna or myself?
I absolutely would, and it's a question that it's odd to share this question with 700 people, but I'm inspired by everything today to ask it. You know, I'm a psychologist. In other words, my training and my thought veers towards the individual level. And I've always been really passionate about prejudice, about eradicating bias, combating stigma. And I despair a lot because I see continued shootings, continued violence, continued oppression that is not at the individual level at which I deal with every day. It's at the level of, as you mentioned, corporations, schooling, law enforcement, justice systems. I mean, really cultural level, layers upon layer of systems that engage each other to maintain and retain that oppression. And I lose hope. I come back, but I don't know where we're going sometimes, and I was wondering what you might have to say.
Well, I'll start by just sharing something I read sometime, which actually I like. I don't know if it's responsive or not, but I like it nonetheless. And it is that hope is nostalgia for the future. And at my deepest level, when I'm most centered, I feel like we have to learn to live without hope and without despair. We have to live with just, we live in what is. It doesn't mean that hope and despair won't happen. And if you ever come to my house, all 700 of you, you'll see a poster which says, I'm not an optimist, nor am I a pessimist. I'm a possibilist. And I believe what we do, there's a possibility that we'll have a positive impact. We don't know. That all we can do is engage, that that's what life is. And I used to say, and I think my daughter's somewhere in the room, I used to say when my kids were small, if I could wish you one thing, it would not be money, it would not be wealth, it would not even be happiness. It would be engagement. And I feel like when we're fully engaged, that first of all, we're no longer by ourselves. And I'll end by just saying this. My father's a Christian minister. One day I was despairing and I was saying, Dad, there's too much going on. I'm doing this work and I can't do it by myself. And he says, John, you're not by yourself. And I think—
You said what?
I'm not by myself. And I think when we remember to link up and live our connectedness, then I think the possibilities are endless.
It helps me to remember that hope is not a noun, it's a verb for me. And hope is not something you have, it's something you do. It's your doing.
Thank you.
It's your responding.
Thank you. Do you have a question that you would like to ask, Joanna?
No, we have 20 seconds. Yeah.
We'll give you one more. We'll give you time if you'd like to ask.
Well, my question comes also from the suffering in the Buddhist tradition is seen as coming not from an evil principle, but from the notion that we're separate. And so that's delusion. And then from that come the two other causes of suffering, makes a triad. The greed that happens when you think you're separate, that you have to keep feeding this little frail self, you'll never have enough, and aggression that you have to protect. And these three get into a positive feedback loop. And in our time, because this came to my mind as I heard Rudy, these three poisons, as the Buddhists call it, greed, hatred, and delusion, have become institutionalized in the media, in the military, in the consumer society. So that is the great riddle. What is it? What can happen for us now? What must happen for us to be able to engage these principalities and powers?
And you know, Joanna, you said something earlier about not turning away from suffering. And I think that as the suffering happens and get big, we feel overwhelmed in our individual self, and we turn away. And I think that's the real tragedy, when we turn away. And we have a double loss. One, we turn away, and we disconnect. And so I think that if we can engage and connect, then I think it's a good chance. Not a guarantee, but a good chance.
And the earth is alive. It's a living system. So there's power that can, when we ally ourselves with life on this planet that we discover is alive, and in service to it, there's a power that can flow through our hearts and minds. Mm-hmm. Don't you find?
I do find. So this is actually, as you can see, a panel of love and light. And we are delighted to share with you, but our time has come to an end, so thank you. And thank Joanna and Rudy.